Frohes Neues and welcome to yet another Pauper video, albeit neither a deck tech nor a gameplay, but instead I want to talk about the effect of the recent bannings in Pauper, namely Wonders Ornament, Prophetic Prism, and also Atog. While Wonders Ornament was more or less clearly a ban meant for what's it called? meant for Tron. Prophetic Prism not only is a nerf to the Tron deck, but of course also to any Affinity deck list, especially the lists that want to go, for example, 2 colors or of course also 3 colors. But in 2 colors, honestly, sometimes you have even more of a problem because you can't run as many dual lands properly. And of course, Atog only seen in Affinity deck lists, but very prevalent there. And yeah, I guess Wizards felt like Affinity was still a bit too strong, which I think has been more or less consensus among the Pauper community. At least locally, I feel like many people also thought that Affinity still might be too strong, even though the Sad Salamander got banned quite a few months ago already. Since the release of the artifact duels in June 2021 in Modern Horizons 2, Affinity has gotten even more consistency and also has gotten some new cards along the way. For example, Blood Fountain is a great card to enable Affinity. I mean, it creates 2 artifacts for just 1 mana, and a few turns down the line, you can grind it out by sacrificing Blood Fountain to get back 2 creatures, and also if you draw 1 too many artifact lands, you can just cycle it with the Blood token when you don't have a need for yet another artifact on the battlefield. So Affinity was really strong, and the question now is, of course, is Affinity dead? And I think we can all easily agree that it's not. I mean, if you just look at the most played Affinity list, it has more or less become a combo deck. You might want to say, where essentially you just want to have Atog plus Fling, and maybe even a Disciple of the Vault or 2. And in case you don't draw Atog, you can still draw, for example, Makeshift Munitions, and you can still at some point kill the opponent. Also, Kraglan Shaman is yet another sacrifice outlet for artifacts that synergizes well with Disciple of the Vault, because you can just sacrifice your whole board into it and you will get all the triggers from the Disciple before the Disciple dies to the Kraglan activation actually. So you can probably easily imagine that the core of that deck is still intact, and you still have all the draw spells, you still have Galvanic Blasts, you still have Myr Enforcers to hold the ground or maybe dish out some combat damage here and there, so it becomes easier for you to kill the opponent in one, let's call it combo turn actually, because to me it feels a lot like it. Like if I compare the more recent Affinity deck lists, like especially this Grixis Affinity lists or blue, red, and black Affinity lists to some lists I have seen or played myself when I started playing Pauper quite a few years ago from now already, or by now. Like the deck has changed a lot, while in former times Affinity had been more of an aggressive deck where you had just very explosive turns early on in the game, and then at some point, if you fail to get the last damage through because your opponent has some blockers or they might want to remove your Atog or whatever, then you have a fling at the ready to kill them. But the deck wasn't focusing as much on having Atog plus Fling as a kill condition or as a win condition. I mean, of course, it still worked quite a few times, but the deck wasn't geared towards getting there as much as it is by now, I feel like. And yeah, I think there's quite a few factors to this evolution of the deck. One of the reasons is we don't only have the what's it called, the original Mirrodin artifact lands anymore. We also have the dual lands since June of last year, but also we got some good cards for Affinity along the way. Like for example, Costly Plunder was already getting hyped, and then we even got Deadly Dispute, which is just strictly better. I mean, it does the same, but also creates a treasure token. So you just sacrifice, for example, Eco Wellspring to Deadly Dispute, and you don't even lose on artifacts on the battlefield. So you don't even lose on Affinity, and you even, at least temporarily, get a mana out of it. So it feels it feels pretty much like casting Ancestral Recall, but it costs one generic and a black and gives you one 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 color or like one mana of your choice for one turn at least. So it's a really strong deck. It has so much potential to just dig through the deck to draw many cards. Also, of course, with Blood Fountain, you can just cycle away a card you don't like and get even further into the deck. Chromatic Star, of course, is still in the deck, and so on. So you have lots of card draw and cycling, so to speak. You still have some mana fix through Chromatic Star, the treasure tokens, and of course the dual lands, and you still have most of the cards available overall. So the question in that deck is, how do you want to replace Atog? Is there still any room for Fling? And what do you put in the place of Prophetic Prism? And I think Wedding Invitation, what's it called, Terrarion, and some other similar style cards, let's say, all fit pretty well into that place, although some of them don't give you the mana fixing you might want to look out for. Maybe you actually don't need that much mana fixing in the deck, even though, of course, having Prophetic Prism was always very nice, but yeah, I guess the deck can still function pretty good without it, especially when you think of that deck list not as that much of an aggressive deck. So if you want to cast anything in the early game, it doesn't have too much of a mana requirement regarding like colored costs. You might want to play some Frogmites, possibly. You might want to pick up on some Gearseeker Serpents, maybe on some what's it called? Ethereum Spinners. And or you might want to replace Atog with Glaze Feet, which let's say has some similar synergy with artifacts, but it doesn't require you to sacrifice the artifacts into it, but instead it checks on artifacts entering the battlefield in order to get pumped. So you might think of that card as just dealing maybe an absurd amount of damage in one turn and then being useless. But actually, if you compare it to Atog, oftentimes when you just attack in, you also only attack for one. Because if you don't have Fling, you don't want to sacrifice like 5 artifacts into Atog and have it removed by a hard removal, or have it bounced by snap or something. So in that regard, of course, there's some differences, some similarities, But actually, with that deck, it's pretty likely that you have a couple of artifacts enter the battlefield in some consecutive turns, so it's not that hard to get attacks going from like 4 to 12 damage in the air, more or less consistently. I mean, 12 damage probably is more or less the high end of that card, but with Blood Fountain, for example, as a top deck in a later stage of the game, you easily get 2 artifact entering triggers right away, and then if you still have the mana available, you can then sacrifice Blood Fountain right away to, for example, get back a Frogmite and a Myr Enforcer from the graveyard, and all of a sudden you are attacking with an 8/9 that only cost you 2 mana. And if you happen to run Ethereum Spinner as well, like you can imagine the synergies, it's pretty likely that you get some big attacks going on. But I think there's actually 2 different Grixis decks. One of them focusing more on the, let's say, combo aspect of Atog, and the other one being just just a synergistic aggro deck, more or less, with some built-in late game abilities, which is more like, as I would dub it, the classical Affinity feeling, at least how I recall it. So in one of the lists, you might want to replace the Atogs with, for example, Clan Shamans, maybe a few Gear Seekers, maybe some Frogmites, maybe an additional copy of Makeshift Munitions, and you probably don't want to play Blaze Fiend as well, since the let's say the available slots are limited, and I think you want to focus on either being a bit slower but having a still pretty consistent, yeah, as I say, combo kill or one hit at some point in the game, or you want to really pick up on Glaze Fiend for the synergies. Maybe you want to run even more 1 mana artifacts. You might want to run Witching Will in addition to Blood Fountain and Chromatic Star. You might want to run Gearseeker Serpent, especially there. When you think of it as a beatdown deck, you still might want to include some Ethereum Spinners in both of the decks, depending on if you play at least some Gearseeker Serpents in the, let's say, combo version. Since, of course, Ethereum Spinner heavily profits from, well, any card that has mana value 4 or more when you cast it. So there is that. And Ethereum Spinner has some interesting synergies. I feel like not only the obvious ones, more or less printed on the card, but also, as I already said, with Glaze Fiend, every Frogmite, every Myr Enforcer is a +4/+4 until end of turn for Glaze Fiend. But also with Makeshift Munitions and, of course, Clan Shaman, and then consecutively also with Disciple of the Vault, because putting out some creature tokens to sacrifice them to deal some damage to the opponent is right down the alley of that kind of deck. So I feel like that's most of what I want to say regarding the Grixis deck lists. I hope I didn't forget anything too important. If I did, I don't know, dislike the video, tell me that I suck in the comments, whatever. And let's talk about another kind of deck that is that has a pretty different feel to it and a pretty different deck list actually, and that is like blue-white or Azorius Affinity, which is a deck that has kind of two synergies going for it, or at least it has different synergies being really important to the deck. The first of them is like Affinity / Metalcraft, so caring about artifacts. In that blue-white deck, you are still playing like Enforcer, Thoughtcast, probably Gearseeker Serpent, maybe Ethereum Spinner, since it is a human, and that is important, as you will see in a moment. Yeah, and you still have these kinds of cards, and then might wonder why you are playing white. If you didn't see that deck list already, you are playing a mixture of Thraben Inspector, probably, which I mean gives you an artifact when it enters the battlefield, Ardent Recruit, and Auriok Sunchaser, and of course, just to mention it, to have it out there, Somber Hoverguard is a potential addition to the deck, since it's also a flyer and it's more or less for 1 blue mana a flip delver as a 3/2 flyer. But yeah, many people don't like that card too much. I just felt like at least mentioning it so you know it's out there. So you see that deck is much more of a classic aggressive list. You have low cost beaters who heavily profit from artifacts being out there. So you can either actually get them out early on, or so they actually grow strong enough to justify playing them. And now the question is maybe, well, why is it important that these cards are humans? Well, you can just play a playset of One Mind because of that, since you have Frogmite, Enforcer, some Gearseeker Serpents as non-human creatures, and potentially some tokens from Ethereum Spinner, maybe, if you want to play it, if you find a slot. And then, well, said Ethereum Spinner and the white creature package I just mentioned of Thraben Inspector, Ardent Recruit, and Auriok Sunchaser, all being humans, easily turns on off One Mind, so you actually have like 8 Thoughtcasts in the deck, which is a fine ratio, I would say. And the one thing you might struggle with is you can, like, your mana base is a bit wonky still. It has been made much better, or overall possible, of course, with the printing of the Modern Horizons 2 dual lands, indestructible artifact lands. What were they thinking? But yeah, well, here we go. So you have a blue-white dual land, artifact land, and you also, of course, still have the original Mirrodin lands of Seed of the Signet and Ancient Den. But that only brings us to 12 lands, so probably you have to include some copies of Darksteel Citadel, or alternatively, what you could do is you could try to go into a third color. You could try, for example, to include a Glaze Fiend, maybe, since it's also a pretty aggressively styled card. You could try to include some copies of Deadly Dispute, and of course also Echo Wellspring maybe. And then if you also pick up on Chromatic Star, you have enough artifacts to profitably sacrifice into Deadly Dispute. And also you could, of course, then also pick up on Blood Fountain, and also, just to put it out there, so you see all the possibilities, Disciple of the Void is also a human, in fact. So yeah, you could easily also go into Esper, or like white, blue, and black. And I think that's also pretty fitting, since Esper was originally, like lore-wise, on Alara, the one world where they were focusing heavily on artifacts, and where these colored artifacts and artifact creatures started to come up as cards. So yeah, might feel cool to build that kind of deck. Also, what you could do, of course, since you are in an aggressive deck, and you are probably lacking removal unless you want to play what's it called? Like Journey to Nowhere, which isn't that synergistic, honestly, like not at all, and also costs you 2 mana. Instead, you could splash red, since you have all the dual lands available, and you could go into Galvanic Blast and maybe Lightning Bolt even, and then you have some good removal for potential blockers, and B, you have lots of direct damage to the opponent's face in case you are missing some reach, let's say, that you would typically not have in the deck otherwise if you are staying just white and blue. Unless, of course, you are running wedding invitations and plan on killing the opponent with big serpents and reinforcers who got a wedding invitation. But yeah, that's the possibilities here, and I guess you have to see what cards you want to include in and what amount of those cards, since you have to watch out not to ruin your synergies too much. I mean, if you have too many humans that synergize with artifacts, but then in turn you don't have enough artifacts, of course, it makes the deck bad. If you like don't really pick up on the humans that much, you don't want to run off one mind anymore, and at that point, why are you even playing white then? And so on. Also, Glazefiend, of course, profits from artifacts hitting the battlefield, and maybe you have too many humans in there to actually still play Glazefiend, and so on and so on. Another possibility you might have in that kind of deck list is you might want to play Bleak Coven Vampires and, for example, Chrome Courier, and turn it more into a Esper control shell, where you profit of the artifact lands because they give you Metalcraft and because they help you, for example, put out some Myr Enforcers and Gearseeker Serpents that you still might want to play. And also you can still play like Thoughtcast, Echo Wellspring, Deadly Dispute, and so on. But you are more prepared to play a bit of a longer game, and you are not going into some explosive affinity direction anyway, so you might want to pick up even on some kind of counter spells or some removal spells that potentially don't synergize with artifacts too much, but they synergize with killing the opponent's creatures, so you can get to the later points of the game where you get to resolve your Bleak Coven Vampires, and so on. Maybe not the best deck, but I guess some of you just have fun triggering ETB effects. So maybe you can play that kind of deck. Maybe you can even make an ephemerate deck with it. I don't know, but you might want to try that in either Esper or even Grixis. I'm not sure, but that possibility is still out there, and I still feel like Chrome Courier should see some play, because to me it seems not too bad, but it's hard to find the correct shell for it. So yeah. What else do we have? We also have a more really hardcore classical affinity deck list that reminds me of the time when I started picking up on Pauper and when I could afford, or like wanted to afford, chromatic spheres rather than chromatic stars, because at that point the spheres were much cheaper than the stars, which I think now it's the other way around. But yeah, I just started the format, so I didn't want to invest too much money into it. I had lots of the artifact lands and the Myr Enforcers already, so I figured I had all the expensive stuff already. And I had a more or less Rug or Timor affinity list, or blue, red, green, whatever you want to call it. And that list played Carapace Forger, which I think still is a good card. I mean, it's essentially a 4/4 for 2 mana, but somehow it has gotten too bad, or at least too bad for the kinds of affinity lists you see today, which don't really want to go into green, other than potentially Carapace Forger, but essentially it's not worth it because it's not your main deck plan, or you don't really need additional 4/4s desperately anyway. But I think in set like Timor Shell or Ruck Shell, you might want to pick up on Carapace Forger and Wave Sifter as green cards, since Wave Sifter, of course, being at 5 mana, you probably won't hardcast it too often, but you can easily cast it in the early game for its evoke cost, and then for 2 mana you get 2 artifacts, so it makes it much more likely that you get some explosive turns early on. In that deck you might even want to pick up on Springleaf Drum again, which also is a card that I didn't really see for years now, although it had been like one of the main factors of Affinity being so explosive like a couple years ago. But yeah, since you don't want to go into that direction anymore in that Grixis shell, don't need it. But yeah, I feel like we might want to try and pick up again on some classic Affinity aggro list. Um, and yeah, if you happen to run Springleaf Drum, for example, what you can do is you can evoke Wave Sifter, and in response to the sacrifice trigger from the evoke, you can tap it with the Springleaf Drum to add 1 mana again. So essentially you get 2 artifacts for 1 mana at that point, which is pretty neat, I think, and makes it so easy for your Myr Enforcers, Gear Seeker Serpents, Frog Mites to hit the battlefield early on. Also, one nice synergy that I really would like to see is if you're playing Ethereum Spinner, which I think in that deck you really want to do it because that deck has the most cards with converted mana cost, or as it now is named, mana value, I think, of 4 or higher. You want to play Ethereum Spinner because it triggers off of Frogmite, Myr Enforcer, Gear Seeker Serpent, Wave Sifter, and Thoughtcast. And I would really like to see a deck where you run all of these. Maybe not for Wave Sifter, since it's a bit hard on the mana. I think playing maybe even a playset of Gear Seeker Serpent is just worth it, even though it's in double blue, because the card is just so strong. And also, if we happen to run Springleaf Drum and Chromatic Star, again, we have some better fixing than most of the other Affinity decks do have. So yeah, we can potentially afford to go into that direction, even though, of course, we can't really justify playing off one mind, and we are not playing Deadly Dispute, so we have much less card draw. Maybe you could actually splash black even for some Deadly Disputes. I'm not sure. I feel like you don't have the slots available, and you are more geared towards just beating down early on, having an explosive turn 2 or 3, following it up with 1 Thoughtcast, and like just getting the last Myr Enforcer and Galvanic Blast you need and kill the opponent by turn 4 maybe, or turn 5, which I think is a good rate for an aggro deck, and it's I think killing on turn 5 is consistently possible for most aggro decks in the format if the opponent can't interact with them or doesn't interact too much with them. So that should be still possible, and I think after the Atog ban, it might have become worth it again to explore that more. I mean, it was worth it already, I think, just because it's, like, to me at least, it's fun trying out new decks, trying to build some new decks. And I guess that's why I made so many different deck takes and videos overall um, regarding Affinity, because although I'm not that much of an Affinity player, I feel like I just like blue way too much, and like really blue decks, and Affinity doesn't essentially feel like a blue deck, it feels like an Affinity deck, I think. So yeah, I enjoy playing that much more, but like I guess you don't really want to see me doing like 6 different videos where I talk about how I change 2 cards in my mono blue Delva deck, or how I'm currently thinking about including one brainstorm more or less, or frantic inventory yes or no in my blue red fairies list or whatever. So yeah, that's why you will probably see um, more Affinity videos from me than I initially expected, since, yeah, as I said, having such a synergistic um, mechanic allowing you to build some different decks makes it very interesting to, at least to some extent, brew with it. And I hope I have given you some information or some inspiration maybe with this video. Maybe we will see more than the one boring list of Affinity we had recently. My opinion, at least, I became really bored from watching the format being like Affinity and fairies essentially. Um, or yeah, at least that's what it looks like to me. Huge both kinds of decks, or deck shells being huge part of the meta and dominating lots of the other decks. Maybe that will get better by now. For example, Elves will have a shot again against Affinity, I think, which was previously very hard, at least from my experience, since I mean, your Well-Wisher just gets Galvanic Blasted, or maybe your 1 mana elf that you would have needed to be as explosive as you need to be early on, and then by turn 5 they just fling Atog to your face and you can't really interact as an elf player, at least in the main board, and then maybe you win one of the two post-sideboarded games, but probably not both of them, so it's essentially most of the times a loss, at least as I said, in my experience. Um, Maybe there are some interesting sideboard choices that I missed so far, but yeah, that's like um, a problem I really had with Affinity. I mean, it was running a Dispel in the main deck, a Dispel in an Affinity deck list. If you had said that to me a couple of years ago, I would have thought, well, why would you want to play it? I mean, Dispel obviously a good card, but what's the purpose in an aggressive deck like an Affinity deck, like a random Dispel? But of course, with the deck going into that combo direction, where you essentially just want to make sure that your Atogs fling resolves, then of course it has its merits to already include at least one Dispel in the main deck, and you can probably sacrifice that one slot, because like you could of course also play a random Gear Seeker Serpent or whatever, but you might as well just make sure your combo resolves, because that's more likely that your opponent dies that way, like more likely than, as I said, another random beta. And Mu Enforcer, I think, was pretty much just in the deck because it's so strong. It doesn't really have any mana requirements. It can be a good attacker early on as well as a defender against some aggressive decks. So yeah, actually, I'm pretty glad that that Atogs got banned because of that. They could also have banned Fling, but banning Fling would maybe hit, for example, some curve deck that wants to fling a big serpentine curve in the opponent's face, and I think that deck isn't too strong. Um, I mean, it looks nice sometimes, but yeah, I wouldn't say it's too strong, and not too many people play it right now. So why do you want to hit it? So it's cleaner to just hit Atog itself, um, especially because there are also other ways out there to sacrifice a creature with lots of power to just deal damage to the opponent directly. Wedding Invitation is still out there, so yeah, probably a good call to just ban Atogs directly. And I'm pretty curious if they will unban the sad Salamander some month down the line, so it's happy again. But then again, maybe that might be a bit too much to essentially have 8 Myr Enforcers, 4 of which potentially can help you fixing your land drops. So maybe, sadly, it will stay banned forever. Although I think it's a cool card. But yeah, what can you do? That much to my, let's say, affinity insight or whatever I will call it. I hope you enjoyed it. I will try, of course, to brew some affinity decks again. I am also, again, working on some other deck techs. Regarding the mono black one, I'm currently trying to kick my friend into into just doing it, but he says he wants to make sure that he has a bit of a script and some ideas, so he properly presents his favorite deck, which of course I can respect and have to respect. So yeah, let's see what the next deck techs are gonna be. I hope you have a good time. Until then, see you. Bye.